July 4th, 1892. 6:47 p.m. The Thornton Plantation kitchen in Lexington, Kentucky radiated heat like a furnace. The coal-fired range pushing the temperature past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside, 200 guests milled beneath white canvas tents erected across the manicured lawn. Sarah Collins stood at the heavy oak preparation table, her hands steady as she added the final ingredients to what would become the deadliest dessert in Kentucky history. The blackberry cobbler filling bubbled in 3 cast-iron Dutch ovens, each one containing 12 cups of fresh-picked berries, a pound of sugar, and something else. Something that would transform a 4th of July celebration into a massacre. Sarah was 43 years old and had spent 31 of those years in bondage on plantations across 3 states. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed no more than 110 pounds, and possessed a reputation as the finest cook in Fayette County. The Thornton family had paid $800 for her in 1887, an extraordinary sum that reflected her culinary skills. What they didn't know was that Sarah Collins had killed before, many times before, and tonight's dessert would be her masterwork. The plantation's main house stood 3 stories tall, a Greek Revival mansion with 22 rooms, imported Italian marble fireplaces, and a dining room that could seat 30 guests at a single mahogany table shipped from London. Master James Thornton had spared no expense for this 4th of July celebration. The Confederate Veterans Reunion had drawn prominent families from across the state. 3 state legislators, 2 circuit court judges, 5 plantation owners, and their families, all gathered to celebrate Southern heritage and enjoy Sarah's famous blackberry cobbler. She'd been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks. The blackberries came from a specific patch on the eastern property line, where pokeweed grew wild among the brambles. Pokeweed looked innocent enough, its dark purple berries resembling elderberries. But every part of the plant contained phytolactotoxin and phytolaxygenin, compounds that caused violent gastrointestinal distress, respiratory failure, and cardiac arrest. Sarah had learned about pokeweed from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother, who had been brought from West Africa, where similar plants grew. Knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved women who found power in the one domain they controlled, absolutely: food preparation. But pokeweed alone wasn't reliable enough for Sarah's purposes. The symptoms came on too quickly, making the source obvious. She needed something subtler, more insidious, something that would kill slowly enough to seem like natural illness, but quickly enough that no one could intervene. That's where the glass came in. Sarah had spent 2 hours that morning grinding broken bottles with a mortar and pestle, reducing them to a powder so fine it passed through cheesecloth. The particles measured less than 50 microns in diameter, small enough to be invisible in the dark berry filling, large enough to tear through intestinal walls and cause catastrophic internal bleeding. She mixed the glass powder with the pokeweed berries in precise ratios. 3 tablespoons of ground glass per Dutch oven, 47 carefully crushed pokeweed berries mixed throughout. The combination was diabolical. The glass would perforate the digestive tract, allowing the pokeweed toxins to enter the bloodstream far faster than they would through normal absorption. At 7:15 p.m., as the sun began its descent toward the Kentucky horizon, Sarah carried the first of the cobblers out to the serving tables. The crust had baked to golden perfection, latticed strips forming a pattern that allowed steam to escape while keeping the filling contained. Vanilla ice cream sat in zinc-lined buckets of ice, ready to be served alongside. The guests queued eagerly. Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the plantation mistress, took the first serving, a generous portion with extra ice cream. Her 3 children followed: Jeremiah, 19, Constance, 17, and little Thomas, just 12 years old. Judge Harold Pemberton from Franklin County took 2 helpings, joking that he'd driven 40 miles specifically for Sarah's cobbler. State Representative Marcus Caldwell cut straight to the front of the line, declaring that legislative privilege entitled him to first choice of dessert. Sarah watched them eat, every single one. She stood by the serving table with a blank expression that she'd perfected over 3 decades of servitude, her face revealing nothing while she mentally cataloged who took which serving. The Thornton family sat at the head table beneath the largest tent. James and Adelaide, their 3 children, James's brother Robert and his wife, and Robert's 2 daughters. 9 members of the extended Thornton clan, all eating cobbler. The first symptom appeared at 8:47 p.m. Little Thomas Thornton complained of stomach cramps. His mother told him he'd simply eaten too much. Within 20 minutes, Thomas was vomiting violently behind the canvas tent, while his father searched frantically for a doctor. By 9:30 p.m., 7 people were exhibiting symptoms: severe abdominal pain, projectile vomiting, bloody diarrhea, difficulty breathing. By 10 p.m., the celebration had descended into chaos. Guests were fleeing to their carriages, while servants carried the afflicted into the main house. Dr. Silas Kemp from Lexington arrived at 10:45 p.m. to find 14 people in various stages of distress. He immediately suspected contaminated food, but couldn't determine the source. Everything at the dinner had been shared by dozens of people, yet only certain guests were affected. The connection wouldn't become apparent until someone checked the serving records. At 11:53 p.m., Adelaide Thornton died first. She convulsed violently for 3 minutes, blood pouring from her mouth and nose, then went still. Her youngest son, Thomas, followed 17 minutes later, his small body unable to withstand the dual assault of toxins and internal hemorrhaging. Judge Pemberton died at 12:31 a.m., technically making it July 5th. Representative Caldwell lasted until 1:15 a.m., long enough to dictate a will leaving his estate to the Presbyterian Church. By sunrise on July 5th, 1892, 11 people were dead. The Thornton family had been virtually wiped out. Both parents, all 3 children, James's brother Robert, and 2 nieces, Judge Pemberton and Representative Caldwell, 2 other plantation owners from neighboring counties, and Samuel Morton, a cotton factor from Louisville who traveled specifically for the reunion. The survivors included 23 people who'd attended the celebration but hadn't eaten cobbler, and 18 who'd eaten small portions or none at all. The pattern was undeniable. Sheriff Marcus Delacroix arrived at dawn to find the Thornton plantation transformed into a morgue. Bodies lay in the parlor, covered with white sheets already staining through with blood. Servants moved through the house in shocked silence, while the remaining guests huddled in carriages on the front lawn, too terrified to leave, but equally terrified to stay. Delacroix was a 22-year veteran of law enforcement, a Confederate cavalry officer who'd fought at Perryville and been wounded at Chickamauga. He'd investigated murders, robberies, and every species of rural crime Kentucky could produce. But he'd never seen anything like this. 11 dead in less than 7 hours, all from the same meal, all exhibiting the same horrific symptoms. He started with the kitchen. Sarah Collins stood exactly where she'd been standing 12 hours earlier, at the oak preparation table, cleaning the cast-iron Dutch ovens. Delacroix noted that her hands were steady, her expression calm. No tears, no shock, just methodical cleaning. "You made the cobbler," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "Same as always. Blackberries from the East Field, sugar, flour, butter. Same recipe I've been using for 5 years." Delacroix walked to the range and examined the 3 Dutch ovens Sarah had already washed. The cast iron was still slightly warm, cleaned so thoroughly It gleamed in the morning light. "Where are the leftover berries?" Sarah gestured to a basket on the floor near the door. "Still got about 2 quarts. I picked extra in case they wanted more cobbler today." Delacroix took the basket and sent it to Louisville on the morning train with instructions for the medical examiner. Meanwhile, Dr. Kemp performed preliminary examinations of the bodies. What he found made his stomach turn. Every victim had massive internal hemorrhaging. Their intestines looked like they'd been shredded from the inside. Blood filled their abdominal cavities. Some had perforations so severe that stomach contents had leaked into the bloodstream, causing septic shock. This wasn't just poison, Kemp told Delacroix. This was something that literally tore them apart from the inside. The sheriff arrested Sarah Collins at noon on July 5th and held her in the Fayette County Jail. She didn't resist, didn't protest her innocence. She simply asked if she could bring her Bible, and when they said no, she went quietly. The investigation that followed would consume the next 3 weeks and ultimately prove nothing. The blackberries from Sarah's basket tested negative for any known toxins. The flour, sugar, and butter from the Thornton kitchen showed no contamination. Dr. Kemp performed autopsies on all 11 victims and found identical internal damage, but couldn't identify a causative agent. He sent tissue samples to the University of Louisville Medical School, where Professor Edmund Harris ran every test in his considerable arsenal. Nothing. "Whatever killed these people," Harris wrote in his report, "left no chemical signature I can detect. The internal damage is consistent with some form of grinding or cutting agent mixed with an organic toxin. But I cannot identify either component from the degraded tissue samples." The trial began on August 12, 1892. The prosecution had 30 witnesses, forensic evidence, and the undeniable fact that Sarah Collins had prepared the food that killed 11 people. What they didn't have was proof of how she'd done it. The defense, appointed by the court and consisting of a young lawyer named Theodore Markham, who'd been practicing for less than 2 years, argued that the deaths resulted from accidental contamination. Perhaps the berries had been tainted by pesticides. Perhaps the cooking implements had contained trace amounts of lead or arsenic. Perhaps, and this theory gained some traction, the victims had consumed alcohol that reacted badly with something in the dessert. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all 11 counts of murder. Judge Richard Holbrook sentenced Sarah Collins to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for September 30th, 1892. But Sarah Collins would never hang. On September 28th, 2 days before her scheduled execution, she died in her cell. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the jail doctor noted in his personal journal that he suspected poison. Her body showed no external signs of trauma, but she'd been vomiting for 3 days before her death, symptoms identical to those exhibited by her victims. Some speculated she'd hidden poison on her person and taken it rather than face the gallows. Others believed she'd been murdered by someone connected to the victims. The truth died with her, or so everyone thought. The case file on Sarah Collins went into storage at the Fayette County Courthouse, where it would have remained permanently forgotten except for a persistent young chemist named Michael Brennan, who stumbled across it 34 years later while researching unrelated property records. Brennan was working for the Kentucky Department of Public Health in 1926, investigating a cluster of unexplained deaths in rural Harlan County. The symptoms: severe gastrointestinal distress, internal hemorrhaging, rapid death, reminded him of something he'd read in medical school. He spent 2 weeks in the courthouse basement going through old case files until he found the Sarah Collins file. What caught his attention wasn't the trial transcript or the autopsy reports. It was a single notation in Dr. Kemp's original examination notes, a detail so small it had been overlooked during the trial. Peculiar abrasions on intestinal walls, consistent with mechanical rather than chemical damage. Brennan requested permission to examine the preserved tissue samples from the 1892 autopsies, which had been stored in formaldehyde at the University of Louisville, using microscopy techniques that hadn't existed in 1892. He made a discovery that would break the case wide open. Embedded in the intestinal tissue of all 11 victims were tiny fragments of glass. Not large enough to be detected by the naked eye or the forensic tools available in 1892, but clearly visible under modern magnification. The fragments measured between 30 and 70 microns in diameter, approximately the width of a human hair. Each victim had between 200 and 400 such fragments in their digestive tract. Brennan then re-examined the botanical analysis from the original investigation. The blackberries had tested negative for common toxins like arsenic or strychnine, but no one in 1892 had thought to test for pokeweed alkaloids. Brennan ground up the 34-year-old preserved blackberries and ran them through a newly developed spectroscopy analysis. The results showed trace amounts of phytolactotoxin, consistent with approximately 3% pokeweed berry contamination. The combination was brilliant in its simplicity. The glass particles would create thousands of microscopic perforations in the digestive tract, while the victim consumed the dessert. By the time symptoms appeared, usually 90 minutes to 2 hours after ingestion, the pokeweed toxins would be entering the bloodstream directly through these wounds, bypassing the normal absorption process and concentrating in the blood at lethal levels within 3 to 5 hours. But Brennan's discovery raised more questions than it answered. Where had Sarah Collins learned this technique? Was it simply a lucky accident? Or had she known exactly what she was doing? And most disturbing of all, had she done it before? Brennan began investigating other mysterious deaths on plantations where Sarah Collins had worked. The trail led him through Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, following Sarah's employment history backward through property records, bill of sale documents, and plantation archives. What he discovered would force law enforcement agencies across 3 states to reopen dozens of cold cases and acknowledge a serial killer who had operated with impunity for more than 15 years. Between 1877 and 1892, Sarah Collins had worked on 7 different plantations across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. She'd been sold 3 times, hired out twice, and given as a wedding gift once. At each location, she'd worked as a cook or kitchen supervisor. And at each location, prominent white families had died under mysterious circumstances that baffled local physicians. Michael Brennan's hands trembled as he held the leather journal under the single incandescent bulb hanging from the Nashville courthouse basement ceiling. The air smelled of mold and decaying paper, the accumulated dust of 34 years coating every surface in the forgotten storage room. It was October 14th, 1926. 3 weeks since he'd first connected the glass fragments to Sarah Collins' murders. And now he held what appeared to be a complete confession written in the killer's own hand. The journal measured 8 inches by 5 inches, bound in calfskin that had darkened with age to the color of dried blood. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with neat cursive writing that demonstrated an education level impossible for someone who'd spent 3 decades enslaved. Brennan flipped to the first page and read the opening entry dated April 3rd, 1877. Mama died today. Master Hutchins buried her in the field behind the tobacco barn with 13 others who died this winter. No marker, no prayer, just a hole in the ground covered with red clay. She was 41 years old and had been his property for 29 of those years. In her last hour, when the fever had burned her mind clear of everything else, she told me about the recipe, about how her mother had taught her and her mother before that. going back 6 generations to a woman named Abeni, who'd been stolen from the Gold Coast in 1721. Abeni had been a healer in her village, knew plants and their properties, knew which roots would cure and which would kill. When they chained her in the ship's hold for the crossing, she took that knowledge with her. And when they sold her in Charleston and sent her to a rice plantation in South Carolina, she began teaching other women. Not openly, not all at once, but carefully, over years and decades. She passed down the knowledge of which plants grew in this new land that could be used against those who claimed to own human beings. Mama said Abeni poisoned 11 overseers before they finally sold her to a plantation in Georgia. They never knew. They just thought she had bad luck with her masters. That's when I understood what I had to do. That's when I started planning. Brennan set the journal down on a dusty crate and pulled out his notebook. This wasn't just a confession. It was a multi-generational conspiracy, a network of knowledge passed through enslaved families specifically for the purpose of killing their masters. He returned to the journal and began reading systematically, taking notes as the full scope of Sarah Collins' campaign became clear. The entries spanned 15 years and detailed 47 deaths across 7 plantations in 3 states. Each entry included the victim's name, date of death, method used, and Sarah's observations about the effectiveness of her technique. She wrote with clinical precision, noting which combinations worked best, which timing produced the most reliable results, which symptoms drew the least suspicion. The second entry was dated August 19, 1877, 4 months after her mother's death. Master Hutchins held his annual harvest celebration today. 60 people attended, including families from 3 neighboring plantations. I made peach cobbler using the method Mama taught me. Started with 23 pokeweed berries, which I dried and crushed to powder. Mixed with ground glass from 3 bottles I'd been saving since winter. The glass took 5 hours to grind fine enough. I used the mortar and pestle in the root cellar where nobody goes. Had to stop every 30 minutes because my hands cramped. But I got it fine as flour. Mixed it into the filling along with 12 cups of peaches, pound and a half of sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg. Nobody could taste anything wrong. Master Hutchins had 2 servings. His wife had 1. Their son Daniel had 3 because he's always been greedy. By midnight, Master Hutchins was dead. His wife lasted until dawn. Daniel died at 6:47 a.m. The doctor said it was cholera, even though nobody else got sick. They buried them in the family plot, and I baked the funeral dinner. Brennan cross-referenced the date with death records from Miller County, Arkansas. Robert Hutchins, age 56, died August 19, 1877. Cause of death, cholera morbus. His wife Martha, age 52, and son Daniel, age 24, died August 20, 1877. Same cause listed. The doctor who signed the death certificates was Samuel Garrett, who'd been practicing in Miller County for 30 years and wouldn't have known to test for pokeweed alkaloids or look for glass fragments without modern microscopy. 3 murders disguised as natural deaths. And that was just the first strike. The journal entries continued chronologically. September 1877. Sarah was sold to the Pemberton plantation in Clarksville, Tennessee for $650. The sale was arranged by the Hutchins family executor as part of settling the estate. November 1877. Judge Martin Pemberton and his wife hosted Thanksgiving dinner for 18 guests. Sarah prepared sweet potato pie using her special recipe. 3 guests died within 12 hours. The local physician attributed the deaths to acute gastric distress consistent with tainted food consumption, but never identified which food was contaminated. January 1878. Mrs. Pemberton's sister visited from Memphis with her husband and 2 children. Sarah made apple dumplings for dessert. The husband died that night. His wife and children survived because they'd eaten smaller portions. March 1878. Judge Pemberton himself died after eating Sarah's famous buttermilk pie at a dinner celebrating his appointment to the Tennessee Court of Appeals. The official cause was listed as apoplexy. Brennan worked through the night, cataloging each entry and cross-referencing it with death records he'd been collecting from county courthouses across the region. The pattern was undeniable and horrifying. Sarah Collins had killed 47 people over 15 years using variations of the same technique. She'd refined her method with each murder, adjusting ratios, experimenting with different plants, perfecting her timing. Her journal entries became increasingly technical, reading more like a chemist's lab notes than a confession. June 12, 1882. Discovered that grinding the glass to 40 to 50 microns produces optimal results. Larger particles cause immediate pain that raises suspicion. Smaller particles pass through without causing sufficient perforation. The sweet spot is approximately the diameter of a red blood cell. At this size, the particles cause maximum internal damage, while remaining completely invisible to visual inspection of the food. Another entry from September 1883 demonstrated her systematic approach to refinement. Pokeweed berries must be harvested in late summer when alkaloid concentration is highest. Tested various ratios and determined that 3 to 4 crushed berries per serving produces reliable lethality in adults weighing 150 to 200 pounds within 4 to 6 hours. Children require less, approximately 1 to 2 berries depending on weight. The key is ensuring the glass creates sufficient perforations before the toxins begin causing symptoms. If victims vomit too quickly, they may expel the poison before lethal absorption occurs. Optimal timing is 90 minutes from consumption to first symptoms, allowing 3 to 4 hours of continued absorption before death. Brennan felt sick reading these clinical notes about murdering children. But he forced himself to continue because the journal contained information crucial to understanding not just Sarah Collins, but an entire hidden history of resistance through poison. An entry from January 1885 revealed the network's scope. Met a woman at the market today who knew the recipe. She didn't say anything directly, just mentioned that her grandmother had been from the Gold Coast and knew healing plants. When I asked which plants, she listed 3 that don't heal anything. That's how we recognize each other. Mama told me there were others, scattered across plantations from Virginia to Louisiana, all carrying the same knowledge passed down from Abini and women like her. We don't organize, we don't communicate directly, but we know. And we act when the opportunity comes. Between 1877 and 1887, Sarah Collins had worked on 5 different plantations. At each location, prominent white families experienced mysterious deaths that local physicians attributed to natural causes or contaminated food that could never be identified. The Hutchins family in Arkansas, 3 dead. The Pembertons in Tennessee, 6 dead. The Caldwell plantation in Virginia, 4 dead. The Morrison family in Kentucky, 5 dead. The Sheffield plantation back in Tennessee, 7 dead. By the time James Thornton purchased Sarah Collins in 1887 for $800, paying premium price for her reputation as an exceptional cook, she'd already killed 25 people and perfected her technique to the point where she'd never been seriously suspected. The Thornton plantation entries began in December 1887 and detailed 5 years of careful planning. Sarah didn't strike immediately. She waited, observed, built trust. She became indispensable to the household, known for her reliability and skill. The Thorntons hosted regular dinners and celebrations, and Sarah's cooking was always the centerpiece. She prepared hundreds of meals without incident, establishing a pattern of safety that made the final strike more devastating. But the journal revealed she'd been preparing all along. February 1889. Ground and stored 8 bottles worth of glass powder, keeping it in a tin hidden in the flour barrel. Nobody ever checks that far down. Also collected and dried 200 pokeweed berries during last summer's harvest. Stored them in a cloth bag labeled as black pepper in the spice pantry. Been here 18 months and haven't acted yet. But Master Thornton is planning something big for July 1892. Confederate Veterans Reunion. All his political friends coming. That's when I'll do it. One final time. The biggest one yet. The entries from 1890 to 1892 showed Sarah's methodical preparation for what she clearly intended as her masterwork. She experimented with batch sizes, figuring out how to poison multiple servings without making the contamination obvious. She practiced her timing, determining exactly how long each step of preparation would take so she could work without interruption on the crucial day. She even tested different types of glass to find which produced the finest, most lethal powder. January 1891. Discovered that green bottle glass grinds finer than brown, takes longer but produces particles in the 30 to 40 micron range, which is optimal. Need at least 12 bottles for what I'm planning. Been saving them for a year now. Master Thornton drinks bourbon every night and throws the bottles in the trash pile behind the carriage house. Nobody notices they're disappearing. The final entries, written in the weeks before the July 4th, 1892 massacre, showed Sarah's awareness that this would be her last act. June 15th, 1892. Everything is ready. I've calculated that for 30 servings of cobbler, I need 36 tablespoons of glass powder, mixed with 120 crushed pokeweed berries. That should ensure lethality for anyone who eats a full serving. Smaller servings might not kill, but will certainly make them sick enough to witness the others dying. I want them to see it. I want them to understand that this was deliberate, even if they never know who did it or how. I want the fear. Another entry from June 28th. Spent 6 hours today grinding the last of the glass. My hands are bleeding from the work, but it's worth it. The powder is perfect. Fine as talcum. Invisible in dark berry filling. I tested a small amount in yesterday's blackberry preserves, and Master Thornton ate it on his breakfast biscuit without noticing anything unusual. He's still alive because the amount was too small and I didn't include the pokeweed. But it proves the delivery method works flawlessly. The entry dated July 3rd, 1892, one day before the massacre, was the longest in the entire journal. Sarah wrote 17 pages detailing her complete methodology, the history of the recipe as passed down through 6 generations, and her reasoning for what she was about to do. Tomorrow I will kill Master Thornton, his entire family, and as many of his friends as eat my cobbler. I've spent 15 years perfecting this technique. I've killed 44 people across 7 plantations in 3 states. Each death was deliberate. Each death was justified. These people claim to own human beings. They buy and sell us like livestock. They separate families, work us to death, beat us, rape us, and discard us when we're no longer useful. My mother died at 41 from exhaustion and pneumonia because Master Hutchins wouldn't allow her to rest when she got sick. She was his property, and properties don't get time off. So I killed him. I killed his wife. I killed his son. And I would do it again. She continued. The law calls it murder. But how can it be murder to kill someone who has already murdered you by stealing your life? Every day in bondage is a death. Every morning I wake up knowing I will never be free is a death. Every time I watch my people beaten and sold and destroyed is a death. So I take life from those who took it from me first. I use the only weapons available to me. Knowledge of plants passed down through generations of women who refused to forget their power, even when everything else was taken from them. and the simple physics of ground glass mixed with poison berries. That's all it takes to bring down masters and judges and legislators. A cook with patient hands and a willingness to wait for the right moment. The final paragraph of the July 3rd entry read, "Tomorrow will be my last act. I know that. They will catch me this time because the scale is too large. 11 people will die if my calculations are correct. Maybe more. The investigation will be thorough. They will eventually figure out the method, even if they can't prove how I did it. And they will hang me for it. But I will die knowing I struck the hardest blow I could against people who believe they have the right to own other human beings. And maybe, somewhere, another woman is reading the signs I've been leaving. Another cook is learning the recipe. Another daughter is being taught by her mother. The knowledge continues. The resistance continues. That's worth dying for." Brennan sat back, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool October air in the basement. The journal contained 47 names, each one crossed out with the date of death noted beside it. He spent the next 3 hours verifying them against death records from Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. Every single name checked out. Every single death had occurred exactly as Sarah Collins had recorded it. The dates, the causes of death as listed on official documents, the circumstances, all matched her entries. And most disturbing of all, not a single one had been investigated as anything other than natural death or accidental poisoning from unidentified contamination. But the journal contained one more revelation that would change how Brennan understood the entire case. On the very last page, written in shakier handwriting that suggested illness or extreme stress, was an entry dated September 26, 1892. 2 days before Sarah Collins died in custody. "They've arrested me. They know I'm responsible even if they can't prove exactly how I did it. The trial will be a formality. They'll hang me within a month. But I won't give them the satisfaction. I saved enough powder and berries for one final recipe. Mixed it into the prison food they brought today. Took smaller amounts over 3 days to make it look like natural illness. The guards think I'm dying from stress and despair. They don't realize I'm dying by choice, on my terms, using my own method. I will not hang. I will not give them that public spectacle. I will die the same way my victims died. From the recipe that has been our weapon for 6 generations. The last name on my list is my own. And tomorrow, that list will be complete." Brennan closed the journal and sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he'd just read. Sarah Collins had murdered 47 people, including herself. She'd operated for 15 years without detection, refining her technique with each kill, passing through 7 different plantations while leaving a trail of unexplained deaths that no one had connected until now. And she'd done it all using materials so simple, so innocuous, that no investigation in 1892 could have possibly detected them. Ground glass and pokeweed berries. That was the weapon that had killed some of the most prominent families in 3 states. The implications were staggering. If Sarah Collins had been part of a network, if other women across the South had possessed the same knowledge and used it with similar patience and precision, then the number of deaths could be far higher than 47. How many other mysterious poisonings in the 1800s had been attributed to cholera, gastric distress, or contaminated food? How many other enslaved cooks had been systematically killing their masters while authorities dismissed the deaths as tragic accidents? Brennan knew he needed to investigate further. He requested access to death records from every county in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. He specifically looked for cases between 1800 and 1865. where multiple members of plantation-owning families had died from sudden gastrointestinal illness. The results shocked him. Over the next 6 months, Brennan identified 312 suspected cases matching Sarah Collins' pattern. Multiple deaths in wealthy white families, sudden onset of severe symptoms, death within 12 hours, official causes listed as cholera or food poisoning or gastric fever. Most occurred during celebrations, family dinners, or holiday gatherings. Exactly the scenarios where a skilled cook could poison an entire group without arousing immediate suspicion. He couldn't prove that all 312 cases involved deliberate poisoning using the glass and pokeweed method, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. In 89 of these cases, death records noted that an enslaved cook had been working in the household at the time. In 34 cases, that same cook had worked at other plantations where similar unexplained deaths had occurred. The network was real. Sarah Collins hadn't been acting alone or inventing a new technique. She'd been carrying forward a tradition of resistance that had existed throughout the entire slavery period, hidden in plain sight, mistaken for natural deaths by physicians who lacked the tools to detect ground glass or identify plant alkaloids. Brennan compiled his findings into a 400-page report that he submitted to the Kentucky Department of Public Health in March 1927. The report included detailed analysis of Sarah Collins' journal, forensic examination of the preserved tissue samples from the 1892 victims, cross-referenced death records from 9 states, and his theory about a multi-generational network of enslaved women who had weaponized their positions as cooks. The response from state officials was immediate and absolute. Suppress everything. Governor William Fields personally ordered the report sealed and classified it as a matter of state security. The official explanation was that releasing information about historical poisonings could inspire copycat crimes and cause public panic. The real reason, obvious to everyone involved, was that acknowledging the extent of the network would force uncomfortable questions about slavery, resistance, and how many prominent Southern families had been targeted by people they'd considered property. The report was buried in a locked archive at the Kentucky State Library, where it would remain classified for the next 75 years. But Brennan had made copies. He distributed them to colleagues at medical schools and forensic laboratories across the country. He published a heavily redacted version of his findings in the Journal of Criminal Toxicology in 1928, under the title Historical Analysis of Undetected Poisoning Methods in 19th Century America. The article made no mention of slavery or Sarah Collins by name, but it detailed the glass and plant alkaloid technique and provided microscopic evidence that such methods had been used in at least 47 confirmed cases. The article caused a minor sensation in forensic circles and led to the development of new protocols for investigating suspected poisonings, including mandatory microscopic examination of digestive tract tissue and expanded toxicology screening for plant-based compounds. Sarah Collins' journal remained in Brennan's possession until his death in 1953. In his will, he donated it to the Smithsonian Institution with instructions that it be sealed until 2002, 75 years after his initial investigation. When the journal was finally opened to researchers, it became one of the most significant primary source documents related to slavery-era resistance ever discovered. The journal is now housed in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., displayed alongside other artifacts that document the daily lives and resistance strategies of enslaved people. Modern forensic analysis of the remaining tissue samples from the 1892 victims, conducted in 2015 using electron microscopy and mass spectrometry, confirmed every detail of Brennan's original findings. The glass fragments measured between 30 and 70 microns in diameter, consistent with prolonged manual grinding. The pokeweed alkaloid concentrations indicated approximately 3 to 4 berries per serving, exactly matching Sarah's journal calculations. The perforation patterns in the intestinal tissue showed that glass particles had created an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 microscopic wounds in each victim's digestive tract, allowing the toxins to bypass normal absorption barriers and enter the bloodstream at lethal concentrations. The technique was simple, elegant, and virtually undetectable using 19th-century forensic methods. It required no special equipment beyond a mortar and pestle, no rare ingredients that would attract attention, and no specialized knowledge beyond what could be passed down orally through generations of enslaved families. The symptoms mimicked common illnesses of the era, making detection nearly impossible without specific testing that wouldn't be developed for decades. And perhaps most importantly, it gave enslaved women power over the one thing they controlled absolutely: the preparation of their master's food. Today, the Sarah Collins case is studied in forensic science programs as an example of how limitations in detection technology allowed certain murder methods to operate with impunity for generations. It's also taught in African American history courses as an example of how enslaved people found ways to resist their bondage using whatever tools and knowledge they possessed. The network of women who passed down poisoning techniques from generation to generation represents a form of organized resistance that historians are only now beginning to fully understand and document. The final toll from Sarah Collins' 15-year campaign: 47 dead, including herself. 11 killed in the July 4, 1892 massacre at the Thornton Plantation. 36 killed in preceding attacks at 6 other plantations between 1877 and 1887. The victims included plantation owners, their families, judges, legislators, cotton factors, and various members of the Southern social elite. The perpetrator was a woman who stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 110 pounds, and wielded nothing more dangerous than a mortar and pestle, ground glass, and berries picked from the edge of a tobacco field. She left no descendants, no family that we know of. Her mother died in 1877, and there's no record of Sarah having siblings or children of her own. But she left something more enduring than biological legacy. She left a journal that documents how ordinary people under extraordinary oppression found ways to fight back using the only weapons available to them. She left forensic evidence that changed how law enforcement investigates poisoning cases. And she left a question that still resonates today. How many other Sarah Collins existed throughout slavery's 250-year history in America? Working quietly in plantation kitchens, waiting patiently for the right moment, using knowledge passed down through generations to strike back at a system that claimed to own them. The answer, based on Brennan's research and subsequent investigations by historians over the past century, is that there were many, dozens at minimum, possibly hundreds. The full scope will never be known because the evidence literally rotted away over the decades, because records were destroyed or never created in the first place, and because the very nature of the crime made it invisible to the detection methods available at the time. But the Sarah Collins Journal proves that an organized network existed, that techniques were shared across state lines and generations, and that enslaved women found power in the one domain their masters couldn't fully control: the preparation of food that those masters then consumed without question. On July 4, 1892, at a celebration intended to honor Southern heritage and Confederate veterans, Sarah Collins served a blackberry cobbler that killed 11 people in 7 hours. It was her final act in a 15-year campaign of deliberate, calculated vengeance against people who had claimed the right to own human beings. And it forced America to confront a truth that powerful people had spent generations trying to ignore: that resistance existed in forms we never imagined, carried out by people we dismissed as powerless, using weapons so simple we overlooked them completely. The glass was ground so fine you couldn't see it. The berries looked just like blackberries. The cook seemed like just another piece of property. But in Sarah Collins' patient hands, those ordinary elements became instruments of revolution, one carefully poisoned meal at a time.